Welcome to the Philosopherse podcast, where we explore the deepest philosophical questions shaping our contemporary world. Today, we're embarking on an advanced analysis of Michel Foucault's theoretical framework, particularly focusing on his genealogy of power and its implications for understanding digital surveillance capitalism. We'll be examining how his concepts of disciplinary power, biopower, and governmentality illuminate the complex power relations embedded in our digital infrastructure.
Thank you. I think it's crucial to begin by situating Foucault's analysis within its broader theoretical context. His work represents a fundamental break from both liberal and Marxist conceptions of power. While liberals conceptualize power as something possessed and exercised from above, and Marxists view it primarily through the lens of economic relations, Foucault introduces what we might call a capillary conception of power that circulates through social relations at every level.
That's a fascinating starting point. Could you elaborate on how this capillary conception of power differs from traditional power analytics, particularly in relation to digital technologies?
Certainly, traditional power analytics often employ what Foucault calls the juridico-discursive model, which sees power primarily as repressive and prohibitive. However, Foucault's innovation was to recognize power's productive aspects, how it creates knowledge, shapes subjectivity, and generates pleasure. In the digital context, this productive aspect becomes particularly evident in what Shoshana Zuboff terms surveillance capitalism. Consider how digital platforms don't merely prohibit or restrict, they actively produce new forms of sociality, new desires, and new modes of self-understanding. The like button on social media platforms, for instance, isn't just a metric of popularity. It's a technology of subjectification that creates new forms of social validation and self-worth.
That's a crucial insight. How does this relate to Foucault's concept of technologies of the self in the digital age?
This is where things get particularly interesting. Foucault's later work on technologies of the self, the ways individuals work on themselves to achieve certain states of happiness, wisdom, or perfection, takes on new dimensions in the digital era. Digital platforms provide unprecedented tools for self-documentation, self-monitoring, and self-transformation. But these technologies of the self are increasingly mediated through what we might call algorithmic governmentality. For instance, fitness tracking apps don't just record our activities, they shape how we conceptualize health, productivity, and self-improvement. They create what Foucault might call new regimes of truth about the body and its optimization. This intersection between technologies of the self and algorithmic governance represents a novel form of power that extends beyond traditional disciplinary mechanisms.
Let's dig deeper into this concept of algorithmic governmentality. How does it relate to Foucault's analysis of pastoral power and his broader conception of governmentality?
Algorithmic governmentality represents what we might call a cybernetic pastoral power. In traditional pastoral power, as Foucault described it, the pastor guides the flock by knowing and caring for each individual sheep. Algorithmic systems now perform this pastoral function through continuous monitoring and personalized guidance, but with a crucial difference. They operate through what Antoinette Rouvroy calls algorithmic rationality, a form of knowledge production that bypasses conscious subject formation. This creates what we might term a double bind of digital subjectification. On one hand, digital technologies offer unprecedented tools for self-expression and self-creation. On the other hand, these very technologies subject us to what Bernard Stiegler calls psychopower, the systematic channeling of attention and desire through technical systems.
That's fascinating. Could you elaborate on how this double bind manifests in specific institutional contexts, schools, hospitals, workplaces?
Let's take higher education as an example. Universities increasingly employ learning analytics platforms that track not just academic performance, but patterns of engagement, social interactions, and even emotional states. This creates what we might call an affective panopticon, surveillance that extends beyond behavior to monitor and modulate emotional and cognitive states. In healthcare, we see the emergence of what I would term algorithmic biopolitics. Electronic health records, combined with wearable devices and AI diagnostic tools, create new forms of medical surveillance that don't just monitor health, but actively shape how we understand and experience our bodies. This represents a fusion of what Foucault called clinical gaze with algorithmic prediction. In the workplace, we see the development of what Phoebe Moore calls quantified self at work, continuous performance monitoring systems that create new forms of digital Taylorism. But unlike traditional scientific management, these systems operate through what Deleuze called modulation, continuous variation and adjustment rather than fixed disciplinary molds.
These examples raise important questions about resistance. How can we conceptualize resistance in a system where power operates through modulation rather than discipline?
This is where we need to extend Foucault's analytics of resistance to account for what we might call algorithmic resistance. Traditional forms of resistance often focused on refusing surveillance or maintaining privacy. However, in a system of modulating control, resistance might require what Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker call protocological resistance, working within the protocols of digital systems to create new forms of agency and autonomy. Consider, for instance, the practice of data obfuscation, deliberately creating noise in one's digital footprint to confound surveillance systems, or what Finn Brunton and Helen Nissenbaum call vernacular resistance. Everyday practices that subvert or redirect algorithmic governance. These aren't just technical practices, but what Foucault might call practices of freedom that create new possibilities for subject formation.
That's a sophisticated analysis of resistance, but how does this relate to what Foucault called games of truth, the ways in which truth is produced and contested?
This is crucial because algorithmic governance introduces new games of truth that operate at the intersection of human and machine cognition. Traditional truth games involved intersubjective validation. Truth claims were contested and negotiated between subjects. But algorithmic truth games often bypass conscious deliberation entirely, operating through what Catherine Hales calls a cognitive assemblages that combine human and machine processing. Consider how recommendation algorithms don't just suggest content. They create what we might call algorithmic regimes of truth, systems that shape what counts as relevant, important, or true through automated content curation. This creates what Mark Hansen terms 21st century media, systems that operate on a timescale below human perception, but nevertheless shape our experience of reality.
This raises profound questions about agency and autonomy. How can we conceptualize human freedom in this context of algorithmic governmentality?
I think we need to develop what we might call critical digital ontology, an understanding of how digital systems shape our being in the world while identifying possibilities for what Foucault called practices of liberty. For instance, we might think about how to create what Foucault calls digital objects that enable rather than constrain human agency. This could involve developing alternative digital infrastructures based on what we might call technologies of freedom. Systems designed to enhance rather than restrict human autonomy.
As we approach the end of our discussion, could you synthesize how Foucault's analytics of power might help us envision alternative futures for digital society?
Foucault's work suggests that power relations are never fixed but always open to reconfiguration. In the digital context, this means recognizing that current forms of algorithmic governmentality aren't inevitable but contingent. They could be otherwise. This opens up what Ernst Bloch called the not yet possibilities for alternative digital futures. We might envision what Bernard Stiegler calls a neganthropological turn in digital technology, systems designed to enhance rather than automate human decision-making. Or what Foucault terms cosmotechnics, technologies that reflect diverse cultural values rather than universal technical rationality. The key is to move beyond both techno-optimism and techno-pessimism toward what we might call critical digital practices. Ways of engaging with digital technologies that enhance rather than diminish human agency and social solidarity.
Thank you for this profound analysis. It's clear that Foucault's theoretical framework, when extended to the digital age, provides powerful tools for understanding and potentially reshaping our technological future. To our listeners, we encourage you to think critically about your own digital practices and their implications for power, knowledge, and freedom. This has been the Philosopherse podcast. Join us next time as we continue exploring the philosophical dimensions of contemporary life. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure engaging in this deep analysis.